She was 8 months pregnant when he said it. Not in private. Not in a hushed voice behind a closed door. He said it in the middle of a boutique, a beautiful, softly lit baby boutique on the corner of Millbrook Avenue, while she stood holding a tiny hand-stitched blanket she had been cradling for nearly a minute, her fingers tracing the embroidered edge, her whole face soft with something that looked almost like peace. And in front of 3 saleswomen, a young couple browsing a stroller display, and his own mother, he looked at Elena and said the words she would never forget. Put it back. You don't need any of this. Stop spending money like it grows on trees. Pause. Let the silence breathe for 2 full seconds. Elena didn't move right away. She simply stood there, blanket still in her hands, her round belly pressing gently against the soft fabric of her cream-colored dress. Her eyes didn't fill with tears immediately. That wasn't Elena's way. Instead, something behind her gaze went very still. The way water goes still just before it freezes. She placed the blanket back on the shelf, carefully, almost tenderly, and she smiled. Not because she wasn't hurt, not because the words hadn't landed exactly where he meant them to, but because in that moment as standing in that store, with those saleswomen exchanging glances they thought no one noticed, Elena Whitmore understood something with absolute clarity. Something her husband Marcus had no idea she already knew. Because here's what nobody in that boutique understood that afternoon, not the saleswomen, not his cold-eyed mother Margaret, not even the young couple who had stopped pretending to look at strollers and were now openly staring. The store he just told her she couldn't afford. She owned it, every last inch of it, every shelf, every hand-stitched blanket, every soft lamp glowing gold in the corner, the deed, the business license, the lease agreement, the trademark on the name above the door, all of it tied, in quiet and careful legal language, to a holding company that had been registered under her maiden name nearly 4 years before she ever became Elena Whitmore. But we'll get to that. First, you need to understand how a woman like Elena ended up standing in her own store, 8 months pregnant, being humiliated by the man she had given everything to. Because the cruelest part of this story is not the ending. It's the beginning. Elena Chen grew up understanding the language of sacrifice before she ever learned to call it by that name. She was raised in a modest household on the eastern edge of the city, the only daughter of a woman named Elena Chen, the seamstress with steady hands and an extraordinary eye for detail, who had come to this country with 2 suitcases, a sewing machine, and a ferocious, quiet belief that her daughter would build something lasting. Diana didn't talk much about what she had given up. She showed it in other ways. In the way she hemmed other people's wedding dresses late into the night so Elena could take extra design courses at the Community Arts Center. In the way she wore the same winter coat for 6 years so Elena's tuition checks never bounced. Elena absorbed all of it, the work ethic, the precision, the unspoken belief that dignity was not something the world gave you. It was something you built, stitch by stitch, thread by thread, in the dark, when no one was watching. By her mid-20s, Elena had used a modest inheritance from her grandmother, combined with years of careful saving, to open a small boutique on Millbrook Avenue. It started as a women's clothing shop, curated, tasteful, affordable without looking cheap. But the neighborhood was changing, growing younger and more family-focused. And Elena, always perceptive, always 2 steps ahead of the obvious, quietly pivoted. She added a baby and children's section. Then she expanded into the adjacent storefront. Then she registered a parent holding company under the name Chen Legacy Holdings, a private entity, deliberately kept out of the spotlight, managed by her trusted attorney and childhood family friend Robert Hargrove. By the time Elena was 28 years old, she owned 4 boutiques, a small warehouse, and a quietly thriving wholesale partnership with 3 independent children's clothing designers. Her name wasn't in any business magazine. She didn't attend industry galas. She wore simple clothes and drove a mid-range sedan and paid attention. She was happy. And then she met Marcus Whitmore. She met him at a charity auction, one of those polished, self-congratulatory evenings in a ballroom with too many chandeliers and too little sincerity. Elena had been invited by a friend and was already calculating how soon she could politely leave when a man sat down across from her with the easy confidence of someone who had never once in his life doubted that he belonged exactly where he was. Marcus Whitmore was, by almost any surface measure, extraordinary, tall, immaculately dressed, with dark eyes that could shift from warm to sharp in the span of a sentence. He was the director of acquisitions for a mid-sized real estate investment firm, ambitious, polished, the kind of man who made rooms feel smaller simply by entering them. He had a laugh that made women feel like it was meant only for them. He had a way of asking questions that made you feel genuinely seen. He asked Elena what she did. She gave her usual modest answer of something about retail, small business, boutique management, the language she used when she didn't want to explain the full picture, partly out of habit, partly out of instinct. Marcus nodded. He said, "That's admirable." There was something in the way he said it that wasn't quite condescending, but wasn't fully respectful either. Just a small, soft note of the wrong chord. The kind of thing you notice but dismiss because everything else about the evening is so warm and bright. She should have lingered on that note. She didn't. They dated for 11 months. And those 11 months were, Elena would later say, genuinely good. Not perfect, but good in the ways that count most when you are falling in love with someone. He remembered small things. He drove her to see her mother on Sunday afternoons. He held her hand during storms, not because she asked him to, but because he simply did. He told her once, over dinner on a rainy Tuesday in March, that she was the most quietly remarkable person he had ever met. And he said it looking directly at her. Not at the restaurant around them or the wine in his glass, and Elena felt it reach some deep and guarded place inside her that she had spent years keeping carefully locked. They were married in October of a small wedding, elegant and understated, exactly what Elena wanted. Marcus's family attended, his mother Margaret, who was gracious in the formal way of someone who has practiced graciousness rather than felt it, his younger brother Drew, cheerful and harmless, and a collection of business associates who filled the room with handshakes and hollow toasts. Elena Chen sat in the front row in a new coat and cried with her whole heart. Elena wore her grandmother's pearl earrings and thought, "This is it. This is the thing I built toward without knowing I was building." But even in the photographs from that day, and Elena would study them much later, alone, searching for what she had missed, you could see the thing she had not yet learned to name. Marcus always stood half a step ahead of her, never beside her, always slightly in front. It was a small thing, the kind of thing that seems like nothing at all, until you understand what it means. In the first year of marriage, Elena did what Elena always did. She adapted, she invested, she gave. She gradually reduced her own public involvement in her boutiques, handing day-to-day management to a trusted general manager while keeping full ownership and financial oversight invisible and intact through Robert's firm. Not because Marcus had asked her to, he hadn't, not directly, but because Marcus had a way of making small comments that accumulated like snowfall. He called her stores cute little shops in front of his colleagues and laughed when he said it in a way that made it unclear if he was joking. He once told his mother that Elena had a little hobby business she was phasing out of, and when Elena corrected him privately later, he kissed her on the forehead and said she was being sensitive. She told herself he was proud, just awkward about expressing it. She told herself the adjustment of merging two lives created friction. She told herself that love required patience, and she had always been a patient woman. And when she discovered she was pregnant, when she saw those two lines on a Thursday morning in their marble-tiled bathroom, her hands trembling with a joy so enormous it had no language, she set every reservation aside. Because this, she thought, was what everything had been for. This small, growing life. This reason. She went to every prenatal appointment alone because Marcus was always in a meeting. She assembled the nursery furniture herself, piece by piece, over 2 weekends, following the instruction manual with the same meticulous focus she brought to everything. She researched car seats, sleep schedules, pediatricians, birth plans. She read books by lamplight while Marcus scrolled through his phone beside her in bed, already half absent even when present. She made excuses for it. She always made excuses. There was one afternoon she was about 5 months along when she came home from a routine checkup with a small photo from the ultrasound, the baby's profile clear as a cameo. She found Marcus at the kitchen island, laptop open, talking on the phone. She held up the photograph. He glanced at it, nodded once without breaking his conversation, and turned back to his screen. She stood there for a moment holding that small photograph. Then she put it in her purse. She never showed it to him again. The first concrete sign came through the most ordinary of objects, a credit card statement. It arrived on a Thursday, a paper statement, which was unusual because they had switched to paperless billing years ago. Later, Elena would wonder if it was delivered by accident, or if some corner of the universe had decided she had been patient enough. She wasn't looking for anything. She was simply sorting the mail at the kitchen counter, one hand resting on the curve of her belly, when she opened the envelope and began scanning the charges. Most were familiar: groceries, utilities, the gym membership. Marcus barely used. But one line item stopped her eyes completely. Maison-Eclat fine jewelry of $4,340. Elena knew Maison-Eclat. It was a jewelry boutique on the north side of the city, small, exclusive. The kind of place you went when you wanted something exquisite and discreet. She had walked past it dozens of times. She had never been inside, and Marcus had certainly never mentioned it. She didn't move for almost a full minute. Then she went to her laptop and opened the browser. Steady, methodical. She already knew, somewhere below the surface of conscious thought, what she was going to find. But knowing something in your bones and seeing it confirmed in pixels on a screen are two different forms of pain, and she was not yet ready for the second kind. She found what she was looking for in 40 minutes. Not because Marcus had been careless. He had been, by his own standards, quite careful. But Elena had a sharp mind and a decade of business experience that had taught her how to follow financial threads. A charge on a secondary card she hadn't known existed. A restaurant booking in his name for two. On an evening he had told her he was in a client dinner. An Instagram account private, but with a profile photograph that showed a woman at a rooftop party in a red dress, tagged at a venue Marcus had described to Elena as the kind of place I'd hate. The woman's name was Vanessa Cole. She worked in marketing at a company that was, Elena would later discover, in the same business park as Marcus's firm. She was 26 years old. She had long hair and an effortless smile, and she used the phrase "living my best life" in her bio. Elena closed the laptop. She sat at the kitchen table with both hands flat on the surface and breathed in for 4 counts. Out for 4 counts. The way she had once read was helpful for managing anxiety. Outside, a car passed. A dog barked somewhere down the street. Completely ordinary sounds in a world that had, without any announcement, entirely rearranged itself. She did not cry. That night, she called Robert. Robert Hargrove had known Elena since she was 12 years old. He had been a young law student when he first began helping Elena Chen navigate a minor lease dispute. And the two families had woven together over the years into something closer than professional acquaintance. He was now a partner at a firm that specialized in estate law and corporate holdings, and Elena trusted him with a completeness she trusted very few people with. She told him, in a calm and measured voice, what she had found, and then she told him what she needed. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said quietly, "Elena, how are you?" She said, "I need you to help me make sure I'm protected. The baby and I," he said, "I'll start Monday." They didn't speak again for 3 days, during which Elena continued to move through her life with a composure so perfect that Marcus, who was not paying close attention, noticed nothing different at all. The confrontation, when it came, was not dramatic. Elena had thought it might be. She had imagined different versions of it. The raised voices, the deflection, the elaborate denials. What she had not imagined was how much worse the truth would be than the drama. She brought it up on a Sunday evening. Marcus was pouring himself a glass of wine at the kitchen island. She put the credit card statement on the counter in front of him, the one with the jewelry charge, and she said, quietly and directly, "Tell me about Maison-Eclat." Marcus looked at the paper. He looked at her. And then he set down the wine glass and said nothing for a long moment, and in that silence, Elena saw the decision pass across his face. Not the decision of whether to lie. The decision of whether to bother. He said, "It's not what you're thinking." She said, "I know her name. Marcus. Another silence. Longer this time. And then, and this was the part Elena would replay for months. The part that settled into her memory like a stone at the bottom of still water. Marcus straightened up, crossed his arms, and said, Elena, you need to think about this rationally. You're emotional right now. You're pregnant. Let's not make this bigger than it has to be. She stared at him. He said, I'll handle it. It's already over. You need to focus on the baby and stop looking for problems. She said, you told me you were in a client dinner on the 14th. He said, Elena, stop. Just that, stop. As though her grief were a minor inconvenience he was generously tolerating. As though the appropriate response to discovering your husband's infidelity at 8 months pregnant was to simply stop. She didn't raise her voice. She picked up the statement, folded it twice, put it in her cardigan pocket, and walked to the bedroom. He didn't follow. A long pause in the narration. Let the silence do its work. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in Marcus that was, in a strange way, more frightening than the initial confrontation. He didn't apologize. He didn't attempt to repair anything. Instead, he seemed to have made a private calculation about the situation and arrived at a conclusion that required, on his part, no further adjustment. He became colder. Not violently cold. Not shouting or slamming doors. Just cold in the way of a thermostat dialed down several degrees. He ate dinner quickly and alone. He came to bed late and left early. He stopped asking about the pregnancy. When Elena mentioned the nursery, or the name she had been thinking about, or the pediatric consultation she'd scheduled, he gave one-syllable responses without looking up from his phone. And then came the afternoon at the boutique. Elena had been experiencing lower back pain common in late pregnancy, and her doctor had recommended gentle activity, light walking. She had decided to visit the Millbrook Avenue store. Partly to check in on the manager, partly because being in that space had always soothed her. She hadn't told Marcus. He had offered to join her that day, which surprised her, and she had accepted. Hoping the way people who have already been badly hurt sometimes still hope that it meant something. Margaret, his mother, had joined them uninvited, as she sometimes did, with the breezy assumption that her presence was always welcome. They had been in the store for 10 minutes when Elena picked up the hand-stitched blanket, and Marcus said what he said. Put it back. You don't need any of this. Stop spending money. Like it grows on trees. The saleswomen went very quiet. Margaret examined a display of ceramic night lights with exaggerated focus. The young couple near the strollers stopped moving entirely. Elena placed the blanket back on the shelf. She smiled. And she thought, he has no idea. She drove home alone that evening. Because Margaret had pulled Marcus aside in the parking lot and Elena had quietly unlocked her car, settled herself behind the wheel, and simply left out. By the time she reached the end of Millbrook Avenue, the sky had opened. Rain hit the windshield in sheets. The kind of hard, sudden autumn rain that comes without warning and makes everything outside the glass look like a painting left in water. Elena drove slowly, both hands on the wheel, the heating system humming low. She reached the edge of Riverside Park, the stretch of green she had walked 100 times. Now barely visible through the downpour, and she pulled over. She turned off the engine, and she said, There is a particular kind of sadness that belongs to women in cars, women who have been strong for too long and finally, alone in a contained and anonymous space, allow something to surface. Not because they are weak, because they are full, because the body eventually insists on being acknowledged. Helena pressed both palms against her belly. The baby moved to a small, rolling shift, the kind she had come to recognize as settling. As if the baby could feel the stillness outside and was simply adjusting. She thought about her mother, about Elena Chen, who had sown through the dark hours and never once told her daughter that love was supposed to hurt, who had simply, quietly, shown her how to build things that lasted, who had smiled at the wedding with her whole heart. She thought about the photograph from the ultrasound, the one she had held up in the kitchen, the one Marcus had glanced at and returned to his screen. She still had it in her purse. She'd been carrying it for 3 months. She took it out now and held it up in the gray light filtering through the rain-blurred windshield. Her baby, her daughter, the ultrasound had confirmed it weeks ago. though Elena had not yet told Marcus, because she had found, by that point, that telling Marcus things felt like placing something precious on a surface that might not hold. She looked at the profile in the photograph, the delicate curve of a nose, the suggestion of a chin, and something moved through her chest that was part grief and part of fierce and nearly overwhelming love. A love so large it reordered everything around it. She said it out loud. There in the parked car with the rain coming down, "I've got you. Whatever happens, I've got you." And then she allowed herself, for exactly as long as she needed, to cry, not for Marcus. She was no longer crying for Marcus. That particular grief had gone quiet, replaced by something steadier and colder, like an ember that has burned past heat into permanence. She cried for the version of the marriage she had believed in, for the Sunday afternoons she had spent assembling furniture alone, for the small photograph she had carried in her purse for 3 months, for her mother, who deserved a son-in-law worthy of her daughter, for the blanket on the shelf, the one with the embroidered edge, that she had put back with careful hands while her husband watched without apology. When the tears stopped, and they did stop, because Elena was not a woman who remained inside her pain longer than necessary. She took a slow breath. She wiped her face. She looked at herself briefly in the rearview mirror with an expression that was entirely unreadable. Then she picked up her phone and sent 2 messages. The first was to Robert. "Start the formal process. I'm ready." The second was to her mother. "Can I come for dinner this week? I need to sit in your kitchen for a while." She pulled back out onto the road. The rain was already beginning to ease. At home, while Elena was driving through the rain, something was arriving in the world that would change everything. A package, left by a courier at the door of their townhouse, signed for by Marcus, who brought it inside and placed it on the kitchen island without opening it. It was addressed to Elena from Robert Hargreaves' firm. Sent under a standard estate correspondence. Heading, carrying documents Elena had requested 10 days earlier. A full legal summary of Chen Legacy Holdings assets, current valuations, and most importantly, the board resolution she had filed that very morning. Marcus left the package on the counter without opening it. He had no reason to think it mattered. He had no idea that it contained the answer to a question he hadn't yet thought to ask. And he had absolutely no idea what was coming. There is a moment in every story, and if you have ever been blindsided in your own life, you will recognize this moment, where all the hidden pieces begin to move toward each other. Not noisily, not with the grand announcement of a plot twist in a movie, quietly, precisely, the way a key turns in a lock. It was always designed to fit. Marcus Whitmore believed he understood his world completely. He believed he understood his wife's capabilities, her resources, her options. He believed, and this was the foundation of every decision he had made in the last 8 months, that Elena was dependent on him, financially, socially, in every way that he calculated to be meaningful. He had never thought to look closer. He had never asked, in 3 years of marriage, to see Elena's business documents. Had never asked for details about Chen Legacy Holdings, a name he had heard once and dismissed as a minor trust of some kind, a small account from her grandmother, something negligible. He had never sat across from Robert Hargrove and realized that the quiet, measured man who occasionally came for dinners was not simply a family friend. He had looked at Elena Chen, at her modest clothes and her steady manner and her careful, unpretentious way of moving through the world, and he had made an assumption. Powerful men often do. But what he didn't know would change everything. Let's go back just briefly to the year before Elena ever met Marcus Whitmore. She was 27 years old, and the original Millbrook boutique had just turned its first genuine profit. Not a large profit, but real, documented, honest. Elena had celebrated by taking her mother to dinner at a restaurant they'd always considered slightly beyond their budget. And Diana had held both of her daughter's hands across the table and said, in Mandarin, the language she always shifted to when she was being completely sincere, "You built this with your own hands. Elena, don't ever let anyone else take credit for it." Elena had nodded. She had thought it was simply maternal pride. She had not yet understood that it was also, in some deep and prescient way, a warning. When she decided to expand and to register the parent holding company and begin structuring Chen Legacy Holdings as a proper private entity, She had done it carefully and deliberately. Robert had advised her on every step. They had structured the holding company with multiple layers of privacy protection. Elena was listed as the sole beneficial owner, but the operating agreements, board structures, and public-facing registrations were filtered through several layers of legitimate but non-transparent legal entities. Not because Elena had anything to hide, but because she had studied enough business history to know that women who built things were often, by various means, gradually separated from what they had built. She protected her work the way her mother had protected her, quietly, thoroughly, without making noise about it. When she married Marcus, she had disclosed the existence of Chen Legacy Holdings in general terms during the prenuptial agreement negotiation. Robert had insisted on it for transparency, but the disclosure was broad and unrevealing. Marcus's own attorney had looked at the filing and classified it as a minor personal business interest based on Elena's careful, accurate description of it as a small retail holding company. The prenuptial agreement had been signed. Marcus's attorney had not pressed for further detail. Why would they? She was modest and unassuming, and the firm was privately held. And no one in the room had thought to ask what small actually meant in dollar terms. The actual valuation of Chen Legacy Holdings, as of the quarter in which Marcus told his wife to put back a blanket she already owned, was approximately $7.4 million. For boutiques, all profitable. A wholesale distribution agreement that had expanded to 8 independent designers. A lease portfolio worth reviewing. A small but genuine stake in a children's lifestyle brand that was growing faster than expected. And the Millbrook Avenue store, the flagship. The original. The one with the hand-stitched blankets and the soft golden lamps, which Elena had expanded, over the years, into the finest baby boutique in the city. But the full picture was even more layered than that. Because 6 weeks before the incident at the store, Marcus's firm had quietly begun exploring the acquisition of retail properties on the east side of the city. It was part of a portfolio expansion. His director had been scouting profitable boutique strips, looking for undervalued real estate gems in gentrifying neighborhoods. And on the short list of properties they were considering, the building that housed 3 of Elena's for boutiques, including the one on Millbrook Avenue. Marcus had seen the address in a property report. He had not recognized it. Why would he? He had never once asked for the address of his wife's stores. He had never visited them. He had told his mother they were cute little shops. He had, just weeks later, told his wife she couldn't afford a blanket inside one of them. The report had crossed his desk. He had passed it to his associate with a note that read, "Good targets. Standard acquisition approach. Price them out." Robert Hargrove had received the first inquiry letter from Marcus's firm on a Tuesday morning. He had looked at the letterhead. He had looked at the return address. And he had called Elena and read it to her over the phone in a voice carefully controlled to be neutral. Elena had gone very still in that particular way she had. Then she had said, "Don't respond yet." And she had started to think. She thought for 4 days. She spoke to Robert extensively. She reviewed documents. She sat in her car in the parking garage of her mother's apartment building one evening and made a list, not an emotional list, but a practical one. Column A, what Marcus had. Column B, what Marcus thought he had. Column C, what was actually true. The gap between column B and column C was staggering. She called Robert on the 5th day. "I want to attend the next shareholder filing meeting in person," she said. "Under my full name. No more staying in the background. And I want the papers ready." "The board resolution you filed?" Robert asked. "Yes." "And the property documents?" "And the full asset list." She paused. "He's going to try to acquire my buildings, Robert. He just doesn't know they're mine yet." Robert was quiet for a moment. Then Elena, "What exactly are you planning?" She said, "I'm not planning revenge. I'm planning clarity." Meanwhile, on the other side of this story, Marcus Whitmore's private situation was deteriorating in ways he hadn't fully calculated. Vanessa Cole had, it turned out, not appreciated being described as handled. She had been expecting something more. She had been in the way of someone who had confused intensity for permanence, operating under the assumption that Marcus's interest in her represented something meaningful and directional. When he had pulled back abruptly, after Elena's confrontation, Vanessa had not accepted it gracefully. She had sent messages. She had shown up at his office building twice. She had contacted a mutual colleague who happened to know Marcus's mother. Margaret Whitmore had found out. And Margaret, for all her cultivated coolness, was a woman of family reputation above all else. And she was not pleased. There had been a tense phone call between mother and son on a Wednesday evening that Elena was not present for, but that Drew, Marcus's brother, who was staying in the city for work that week, had been uncomfortably close to. Drew was not his brother's keeper, but Drew was, in his straightforward way, uncomfortable with cruelty, and he had not forgotten the look on Elena's face in the boutique. The way she had placed the blanket back with such careful hands. The way she had smiled as though she knew something. Drew had called Elena the following Sunday, while Marcus was at the gym. "I don't know what's happening," he said, "but I want you to know if you need anything. Anything at all." Elena had thanked him warmly. She had said, with perfect calm, everything is going to be fine, Drew. She had meant it. The divorce papers arrived not from Elena, but from Marcus on the Monday of the following week. She had not expected him to move first. It was, in retrospect, his last significant miscalculation, the moment he believed that he controlled the pace of what was coming. He had retained a lawyer, a sharp and aggressive man named Carlton Reed, who specialized in high-asset divorces for wealthy clients and who had built a reputation on cornering the less financially powerful party before they had time to fully organize. The letter was delivered to the townhouse by a courier. Elena signed for it herself. Standing in the doorway in her bathrobe at 9 in the morning, she brought it inside. She read it. Carlton Reed had filed for dissolution of marriage on the grounds of irreconcilable differences. The initial filing made a series of bold claims about marital assets, positioning Marcus as the primary financial contributor to the marriage and framing Elena's small business interests as largely symbolic. It requested a division of assets that awarded Marcus the townhouse, the primary investment accounts he had built during the marriage, and a minimal spousal support arrangement. It referenced Elena's limited independent earning capacity, made no mention, anywhere, of the possibility that Elena might have significant independent financial holdings, because Carlton Reed had done due diligence. And his due diligence had been thorough by normal standards. But Chen Legacy Holdings was structured in a way that normal standards due diligence did not reach. It was not hidden. It was simply private, as private companies are permitted to be. And without a forensic financial investigation specifically targeting Elena Chen's personal holdings, the valuation was invisible. Carlton Reed had not conducted a forensic investigation. He had seen small retail business and moved on. Eleanor read the letter twice. Then she called Robert. He filed, she said. "I know. My office received the copy this morning." A pause. "Carlton Reed is aggressive. He's going to push hard in the first 6 weeks. Let him," Elena said. "In the meantime, I need you to pull together the full legal summary, full asset schedule, appraisals, everything." She paused. "And Robert, the Millbrook Avenue property, valuation, the building he's trying to acquire." "Yes." A brief, warm silence. "Elena, you know I'm going to enjoy this," she said. "Please don't enjoy it too much. This isn't about enjoyment." "What is it about?" She thought about the rain on the windshield, about the photograph in her purse, about her mother's hands in hers across a restaurant table, about the blanket on the shelf. "It's about truth," she said, "just the truth." The meeting was scheduled, at Marcus's firm's request, as a preliminary acquisition negotiation. They wanted to make an offer on the Millbrook Avenue property. They had contacted Chen Legacy Holdings' registered business address and arranged a formal sit-down. Carlton Reed's office had also been invited, divorce proceedings being what they were. Any significant asset liquidation during the process needed legal coordination. Robert had accepted on Elena's behalf without disclosing who Elena was. The meeting was held in a conference room on the 14th floor of a glass tower downtown Marcus's firm's office. Long table, wide windows, the city spread below like a gray and silver circuit board in the November morning light. There were 5 people on Marcus's side, his associate director, 2 junior team members, Carlton Reed, and Marcus himself. He was there primarily because the acquisition had become personal to him, He had identified the Millbrook strip as his flagship piece for the new portfolio. And he had told his board it was a near certain deal. Robert arrived first, alone. He was shown to the conference room and offered coffee, which he accepted. He sat at one end of the table and organized his papers in a neat stack. Marcus arrived with his team 3 minutes later. He shook Robert's hand with the automatic warmth of a man accustomed to controlling rooms. Robert Hargrove, good to see you. He had met Robert twice, briefly at Elena's family dinners. He associated him, pleasantly but vaguely, with those events. He did not connect him, in this context, to anything concerning Carlton Reed set down his briefcase. The associate director opened with a slide presentation, a property overview, acquisition rationale, preliminary offer figures. And then the conference room door opened. Elena walked in. She was 32 years old, 8.5 months pregnant. Wearing a structured charcoal blazer over a navy maternity dress, her dark hair pulled back from her face with an understated elegance that required no effort because it was not constructed, it was simply who she was. She carried a leather portfolio. She wore her grandmother's pearl earrings. She was calm in the way of deep water, not still, exactly, but possessed of a depth that the surface of the room could not measure. She said, "Good morning." The associate director looked at her, then at Robert, then back at her, with the pleasant confusion of someone waiting to be introduced to a guest. Marcus had gone completely still. He was staring at his wife, at his heavily pregnant, quiet, immovable wife standing on the opposite side of a conference table from him in a building he worked in a meeting he had called, in a negotiation he had expected to control. Carlton Reed's eyes moved rapidly between Elena and Marcus. In the practiced way of a lawyer recalibrating, Robert said, with pleasant professionalism, "Gentlemen, I'd like to introduce Elena Chen, the beneficial owner of Chen Legacy Holdings, and the sole decision-making authority regarding all properties in this portfolio." Elena sat down. She opened her portfolio. She placed a document on the table, a full legal certification of ownership, prepared and notarized, with Chen Legacy Holdings asset schedule attached. She placed a second document beside it, the current independent appraisal of the Millbrook Avenue property, with the current year revenue figures, the lease portfolio summary, and the wholesale agreement values itemized on the last page. She said, in the same measured and unhurried voice she used for everything, "I understand your firm submitted an acquisition inquiry for several properties managed by this holding company. I wanted to meet in person to discuss the terms and to make something clear at the outset." Associate director was looking at the documents now, his face cycling through surprise and professionalism and the beginning of a genuine recalculation. Carlton Reed had pulled one of the pages toward him and was reading with an expression that had gone very controlled. Marcus had not moved. His hands were flat on the table. He was looking at his wife, at the woman he had told to put back a blanket, at the woman he had described as having a hobby business, at the woman whose limited independent earning capacity was itemized on a page in front of him at a figure that was, by conservative estimate, 4 times what he had earned in the past year. Elena looked at him directly, not with anger, not with triumph, with something far more composed than either, of a kind of clear and wavering acknowledgement. "I see you. I have always seen you. And I have always known exactly what I was doing." She said, "The Millbrook Avenue boutique is not for sale. None of the properties in this portfolio are for sale. This meeting was accepted so that I could clarify the position of Chen Legacy Holdings directly, and so that all relevant parties." She glanced briefly at Carlton Reed, who could understand the full financial context going forward. She turned to her documents again. "Robert, would you like to proceed with the full asset summary for the record?" Robert said, with pleasure. What followed was 37 minutes of documentation. Robert walked through the full asset schedule with the calm precision of a man who had been building toward exactly this moment for months. The conference room had gone completely professional in the way of spaces where the balance of power has shifted and everyone present is recalibrating privately. While maintaining an external composure, Carlton Reed had stopped writing and was simply listening. The associate director had begun making small pencil notes with the focused energy of someone adjusting his mental map in real time. Marcus sat through all of it without speaking. He was present in the room in the purely physical sense. Everything else, the confidence, the easy authority, the half-step-ahead posture, had gone somewhere else entirely. At one point, when Robert read aloud the current valuation of the wholesale partnership, Marcus's eyes dropped briefly to his hands on the table. It was the only outward sign, but Elena saw it. When the documentation was complete, Elena closed her portfolio. She addressed the full room. "I want to be transparent," she said. "I have never sought to obscure what I own. The holding company's legal disclosures are current and compliant with all applicable regulations. What I have done is manage my assets privately, as I have every right to do." She paused. Going forward, given the circumstances, and here she did not elaborate on which circumstances, but no one in the room needed her to. "My attorney will be handling all communications regarding the divorce proceeding and the business separation." She gathered her documents. She stood. "I appreciate your time," she said to the associate director, who said nothing at all, which was the most honest thing he could have done. She looked at Marcus one final time. His face was unreadable now, not the easy blankness of a man unbothered, but the tight blankness of a man processing something he has no prepared language for. He was looking at his wife, freely looking, perhaps for the first time in a very long time, and seeing someone he had entirely misunderstood. She said nothing more to him. She said nothing more to him because there was nothing left to say that the documents hadn't already said more eloquently than any words she could have chosen. She turned, and she walked out of the conference room. Her footsteps were even and hurried on the polished floor. The door closed behind her with the soft, complete sound of a chapter ending. Robert joined her in the elevator lobby 30 seconds later. He pressed the down button and stood beside her without speaking for a moment. Then he said, "Carlton Reed is already on his phone." Elena said, "Good." The associate director looked like he wanted to ask for your number. She almost smiled. "Robert, sorry." He was quiet again. Then Elena, "You were extraordinary in there." She looked at the elevator doors. "I was just truthful," she said. "That's all I've ever tried to be." The elevator arrived. They stepped inside. As the doors closed, Elena placed one hand gently on her belly. The baby moved, that familiar, rolling shift, settling. The news, as news does in tight professional circles, traveled. It didn't travel loudly. Elena had made no public announcement, issued no statement, given no interview. She was not that kind of person. But Carlton Reed was a known attorney in the city's legal community, and Robert Hargrove was equally known. And when a divorce proceeding suddenly reveals that one party's asset position is dramatically different from the initial filing's presumptions, people in adjacent circles become aware. Marcus's associate director mentioned to a colleague, who mentioned to a contact, who mentioned to someone who knew someone who ran a business journalism brief, that the acquisition meeting had not gone as anticipated. No specifics, just the general impression. A deal that had seemed straightforward had turned out to be anything but. Carlton Reed filed an amended financial disclosure request within 48 hours. He called Robert 3 times in 2 days. Robert returned the calls at his own pace and answered everything with meticulous and excitable completeness. The townhouse, which Marcus had presumed he would keep, was, it turned out, partially purchased using proceeds from Chen Legacy Holdings that Elena had contributed to the down payment in year 2 of the marriage. Robert had the wire transfer records. The investment accounts were more complicated, as Marcus had contributed significantly to those. But the prenuptial agreement, which Carlton Reed had initially expected to be his primary tool, had a clause inserted by Robert 3 years ago in language that Carlton had apparently not flagged during his initial review, that specified any marital asset dispute be subject to mediation before court proceeding, and that the mediator be jointly agreed upon. Robert had a candidate in mind. Carlton Reed did not like the candidate. This was not a trap. Exactly. Elena had not designed it as a weapon. She had designed it as a protection, a way to ensure that if her marriage ever ended, it would end through process rather than through aggressive one-sided litigation. It was, as most things Elena had ever built, simply thoughtful. Asterisk music, a warmer note threading through the undertone, not resolution yet, but the anticipation of it. Margaret Whitmore called Elena once. During this period, on a Thursday afternoon, Elena answered on the second ring. Margaret said, in her careful voice, I want you to know that I had no idea about the woman. About any of it. A pause. I'm sorry. For what it's worth. Elena said, I believe you, Margaret. Another pause. He's going to realize, eventually, what he's thrown away. Elena said, I think that's true. But it's not my concern anymore. Margaret said, the baby, I'll make sure she knows her father's family. Elena said, if he wants to be part of her life, I won't prevent that. She deserves to make that choice herself when she's old enough to make it. There was a long silence on the line. And then Margaret Whitmore, who had spent 40 years being gracious in the formal, practiced way of someone who had learned it rather than felt it, made a sound that was surprisingly close to genuine grief. Elena said, gently, goodbye, Margaret. She hung up. She stood by the window of her mother's kitchen. She had moved into Diana's apartment in the second week after the conference room. And Diana had received her without questions, without speeches. Simply with a bedroom cleared, and a pot of congee warming on the stove. And it was perhaps the most profound act of love Elena had experienced in years, and she watched the street below. Leaves turning. An elderly man walking a small dog. A child in a red coat jumping a puddle. Diana came to stand beside her, both of them looking out at the same ordinary street. Diana said, in Mandarin, you built this with your own hands. Elena said, in the same language, I know, Mama. Diana put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. Elena leaned into her, just slightly, her cheek resting against her mother's silver-streaked hair. The two of them standing in the window light with the whole world outside continuing its business. Unaware and unhurried. Lily Whitmore. Elena had chosen the name herself, months earlier. Written in her journal on a Tuesday night while Marcus scrolled beside her in bed. Arrived on the 14th of November. At 6:23 in the morning, in the clean and quiet way of someone already certain of her own arrival. Elena's labor was long but steady. Diana sat beside her the entire time, holding her hand through each contraction, not saying much. Simply being present in that specific and irreplaceable way that only a mother can be, not trying to manage the pain, not offering unsolicited reassurance, just there, solid and warm and constant. Marcus was informed. He came to the hospital. Elena had expected that, and had asked Robert to ensure there was a clear, respectful boundary in place. He arrived in the waiting room. He did not enter the delivery room. That was Elena's choice, and she had made it without anger and without drama. She had simply decided that the first face her daughter saw after her own should not belong to someone who had made Elena feel small in her own store. Drew came. He sat in the waiting room with Marcus, awkwardly and kindly, because that was who Drew was. When Lily arrived at 7 pounds, 4 ounces, with dark hair and the beginning of what would become her grandmother's cheekbones, Elena held her against her chest and felt something complete itself. Not the story. Not the divorce proceedings, which would take another 6 months, and resolve in Elena's decisive favor. Not the rebuilding of a life recalibrated around her own terms. None of that was complete yet. But something deeper. Something older than the story of Marcus Whitmore or Chen legacy holdings or conference rooms and divorce papers. Something that had started with Diana Chen sewing in the dark, and continued through Elena building her first boutique, and had always been moving, through every sacrifice and every patient, accumulated act of building, toward exactly this small, perfect face, this warmth against her chest, this complete and unconditional new beginning. She named her Lily. Lily Chen Whitmore. Later, much later, after a quiet legal process that felt less like closure than like exhaling, simply Lily Chen, her mother's name, her grandmother's name, the name of a lineage of women who built things with their hands in the dark, and did not wait for anyone to take credit. In the weeks after Lily's birth, Elena did something she hadn't done in a long time. She walked back into the Millbrook Avenue boutique slowly, a sleeping infant in the carrier against her chest, the manager holding the door with a wide smile, and she walked the length of it. The golden lamps, the cedar and lavender scent, the carefully curated shelves, the small details she had spent years selecting and refining, the embroidered blankets on the lowest shelf, folded in careful stacks, each one stitched by hand. She picked one up. She turned it over in her fingers, tracing the embroidered edge exactly as she had traced it on that afternoon when Marcus stood behind her and said the words she would not forget. Saleswomen behind the counter were pretending to organize inventory. They were watching her with the gentle attention of people who sense that a moment is happening. Elena brought the blanket to the counter. She said, "I'll take this one." The manager smiled and reached for the register. Then she stopped, and certain. "Mrs." she corrected herself. "Elena, it's yours. You don't have to," Elena said. Gently and warmly, "Bring it up. I want to buy it." The manager nodded, a little emotional, and did. Elena tucked the folded blanket into her bag with one hand, the other resting warm against Lily's sleeping back. She looked once more around the store at everything she had built, everything she had protected, everything she had never made noise about, never needed to make noise about, because it was simply and solidly hers. She walked to the door, pushed it open, stepped out into the cool November air. The street was busy with the ordinary life of a weekday morning, people walking quickly, coffee cups in hand, the city doing what cities do. Indifferent and alive. Elena stood for a moment on the sidewalk with the pale winter sun falling on her face and her daughter asleep against her heart. She thought about Marcus. Briefly, not with bitterness, because bitterness requires ongoing energy and Elena had better uses for hers. She thought about him with something closer to understanding. He had made the oldest mistake powerful people make. He had looked at a woman who chose to be quiet and decided she was small. He had looked at someone who chose not to compete on his terms and decided she was losing. He had never understood that she had never been playing his game at all. She had been building something else entirely, and she was not finished. Diana Chen met her outside the store. She had waited on the bench across the street, her silver hair neat in the morning air, a thermos of tea in her hands. She looked at her daughter coming through the boutique door, at the sleeping baby against her chest, at the paper bag with the blanket inside. She said nothing. She simply stood. Elena crossed the street to her. They walked together slowly, in the quiet way of people who do not need to fill silence, and down Millbrook Avenue in the November morning, past the bare branch trees, and the shop fronts, and the coffee carts, and the ordinary, irreplaceable, continuous life of a city going about its business. There are women who become powerful because they were always reaching for power. And then there are women whose power was never the point, who were simply, quietly, faithfully building something real, something lasting, something no one could take from them. Because by the time anyone thought to try, it was already woven too deep into the structure of the world to remove. Elena Chen was the second kind. She walked down her street, in her city, past her stores, with her daughter against her heart, and her mother at her side. She did not look back. She had no reason to. She had never needed his permission. She had never needed his validation, his credit, his understanding of what she had built or why she had built it. She had built it the way her mother had built everything, stitch by stitch, in the dark, for reasons that were larger than recognition. The boutique would remain. The holding company would grow. The blanket was folded in her bag, purchased with her own card, from her own store. On a morning when the air was cold and clear and full of the particular light that comes in November, the kind of light that doesn't flatter, that shows things exactly as they are, without softening or shadow. And Elena Chen walked home. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own quiet strength, or someone you love, leave a comment below. Share it with a woman who needs to hear it today. And if you're new here, welcome. We tell stories about the kind of strength that doesn't ask for applause. Subscribe if you want more. We'll see you in the next one.